So I watched a comedy special from Adrienne Ippoliucci, I think her name is. I might be saying that wrong. Called The Dark Queen. It is produced by Louis C.K. And it shows so much. Her comedy reminds me so much of his, like, circa, like, Chewed Up era. You can tell he was a big influence on her, and that's probably one of the reasons he's, like, producing her. I don't know. I feel like there's a whole conversation to have around Louis C.K., like, forcing his way onto the scene. I know we've talked about him before, but just, like, briefly, my feeling is what he did wasn't necessarily 100% unforgivable. There was probably a road to redemption. There's levels of, sex crime and stuff like that. And that if he, apologized and worked through things with his victims, it's not like he should have been, completely shunned necessarily or whatever. There is a path to redemption and stuff. It's arguable what happened with that. He gave kind of a half-hearted apology and just forced his way onto the scene again, just started doing things, and there were protests, and he didn't seem to care. He made in my opinion, too light of it in his material and stuff like that, and seemed to play into that right-wing crowd and kind of just be gross and not address it in any serious way, where he could have, and it was particularly disappointing because his material, he always kind of championed that kind of maturity and taking ownership of things and growing and stuff like that. And it seemed like he, just was very hypocritical about that. Anyway, I think that means there's a conversation you could have about him now, like producing and putting up these female comics like Jordan Jensen. Is he trying to make amends? Is he saying, well, look, I'm going to do this, I'm still going to do it, but how can you say something against it? Because this is a woman I'm putting up here, and watch, she's raunchy and dirty, just like me. So, anyway, that's the whole conversation, though. I just wanted to talk about her special. I think you should definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. To me, it's not my thing now. I would have loved it like 10 or 15 years ago, and that's not to knock it. It does feel a little old-fashioned, though. It's a lot of shock just for shock's sake. She says a lot of stuff that's like a very, cancelable, call the dogs on her. But it's kind of a scattershot, and it doesn't feel like it's really punching down most of the time, and it doesn't feel like it actually comes from a place of hate. It just feels like it's like writing shock to write shock, which is fun, You can kind of, a lot of people talk shit about it because they say it's easier. It doesn't feel like that. Her stuff feels witty enough to where I wouldn't say it's like that. It just, to me, feels like a little more old-fashioned of a sense of humor. I'm kind of just past. I've had enough of it. But I feel like there's definitely a place for it still. And if that's what you're looking for, she did a great job with that. And there were a lot of jokes that had me actually laugh. A couple of them that I felt bad laughing at. So, that's always a good sign in a comedian. They should be able to do that. But some of them did feel just kind of cheap and stupid. She did make some trans jokes that I thought weren't hateful and were able to, like, poke fun, but not in a hateful way. I think right now is not the time to poke fun at the trans community. When a group so marginalized is being, like, actively, violently, like, targeted and stuff, like, I feel like just lay off it, completely. But if you're doing a scatter shot, making fun of everybody, and you're going to, hit them as well, the trans community, I think most of her jokes were done in such a way I don't think they're problematic. I think they're fair as far as if you're just going for that kind of shock humor. But it does feel very Louis C.K. and it does feel very old-fashioned.
Yeah, I actually saw that Adrienne Ippoliucci special. I started watching it. I usually don't watch comedy specials in one sitting. I either will watch a little bit of it and then tap out, or I'll watch it for a while and then maybe come back to it later. I thought her special was okay. I actually found out about it because I'm still on Louis C.K.'s email list, the one that you got kicked off of for harassing him. So he sent out a long, message about, well, hey, this is a comic I really believe in, and me and her, we've talked a lot, and And I don't know what he said. I didn't really read it. But one other funny thing about her is she went on the Adam Freeland show, which is like the new iteration of Come Town, which I thought was funny. Who knows how she knows those guys. I guess they're all just around in the New York scene, so they all know each other. I'm always impressed by how many New York comics there are, and just like how huge that social scene seems to be, and that there's like a pretty wide basket of New York comics that are relatively successful. So I'm always kind of impressed by that. It's like a never-ending cast of characters. As far as Louis C.K. propping up comedians like that, I think there's probably a part of him that's like, yeah, you see, I'm doing good. I'm lifting up female talent and, showing that I'm not. But also part of me, I think he's always done that. And so I kind of get where he's coming from on that, where he's like, well, I've always done this because it's important to me. The stuff I did, and maybe even the fact that I didn't handle it well when all the shit came to roost, doesn't take away from the fact that I have always supported women and, try my best to prop them up. I just failed those women at that point in my career and handled it pretty badly. But doesn't mean that he can't still support female comics. I mean, if anything, it just kind of makes it so that like it's maybe ultimately more of an inconvenience for them than anything. Another person that comes to mind who's not a female is Joe List, where Joe List got a big bump from being platformed by Louis C.K. and they did a movie together and they did interviews together. And, Joey List has been a pretty big name since then, but I've noticed that he's lost steam a little bit. He's still on the grind, but it seems like he put out a lot of good material and then now is just a little bit more like coasting. I haven't really heard great material from Joe List in a while. And he seems like one of these comics that, like we've talked about, like is almost a little sick of his own shtick. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't seem to, whenever he goes on podcasts or whatever, he just seems a little like, I don't know, like not in a great creative groove. He's not somebody that I think of as being like really on it in comedy. So I don't know. I mean, it's possible that the Louis C.K. cosign, has a downside as well. Like maybe it gave him a nice little bump, but not that sustainable. And if you're not like a really charming, really charismatic comic, maybe the Louis C.K. bump only takes you so far. Whereas Jordan Jensen has done a ton of stuff, not in relation to Louis C.K., and she seems to be doing great. So, if this Adrienne Iabelucci lady can benefit from a Louis C.K. cosign, then I do think that that's probably the best thing that he could be doing with his clout is platforming women and not himself. I'd rather him be doing that than doing all these half-ass specials that he's been doing. So yeah, I mean, if he wants to find talented female and male and other type of comedians and, give them a little bit more of a platform, then he should do it, as long as it doesn't end up hurting their career in the long run, which is not necessarily out of the question.
Yeah, Joe List is an interesting one because I really liked him when I first discovered him. He had that one special that he released on YouTube. Was it Shot in the Comedy Cellar? I don't think it was, but it looked like somewhere similar. It looked similar to that. I played it at work. I think I might have shown it to you. I don't know. Back in the day, but I liked him there. And then I didn't really see a lot from him until he started popping up with Louis C.K. And he did kind of just come across as like a wet fish in all those interviews, like on Joe Rogan and stuff like that. It was weird. He seemed a little out of sorts, and I didn't know what to attribute it to. At first, it seemed like maybe he felt weird about being there with Louis, and then I realized, no, it's not that. And then it seemed like, I don't know, later he seemed kind of cocky. He just didn't come off very good in that setting. I don't think he was the right kind of charming for those kind of interviews. And I've seen like one whole episode of his podcast. I think I told you about that. And that was, he was just insufferable in that. And then I've seen some other clips of his podcast, and he seemed pretty unbearable too. So I don't know. I guess Joe List just sucks.
It's possible that Joe List was just kind of like not ready for the level of visibility that he got, because he did get really big. I mean, he's one of the more visible comics in the sort of like one step below the surface scene. Like, you might not have heard of Joe List unless you're like a fan of comedy, but if you're a fan of comedy, you've almost certainly heard of him. And it may just be that he didn't quite have the skill set to really pad out a career like that. I mean, in order, like you mentioned, you know, you're doing all these different kinds of interviews, you're doing podcasts, you're doing movies, you're doing stand-up in different contexts, and it's like, that's a lot of skills that you have to have in order to keep all those balls in the air. And it's possible that he's just like doesn't have enough natural charisma and doesn't have enough quite dialed in skills to like really cut it, at least right now in those environments. Maybe he burned himself out a little bit. I don't know. I think he's still good. I think we'll still see good stuff from him in the future, but I've never been a huge fan of his sort of like on stage persona. So it's possible that it's also just worn on me a little bit, but you can kind of tell when these guys lose steam a little bit and they start to get bored of their own material. They start to get bored of being on stage. They get bored of doing podcasts, and you can just kind of tell there's sort of like a resentment that sort of emanates from them at a certain point.
Yeah, that's a good point. He was kind of thrown into it, and also not everyone's great at interviews. Not everyone's that kind of like charming or on the spot funny. You know, it takes a little bit of, you know, improv sensibilities. It might not be his thing or whatever. I don't know. He might have a huge improv background. I don't know. But I'd be surprised from what I saw. But it is kind of unfair to him. And, you know, that one first special I saw was so good, and some of the other stuff hasn't lived up to it. But it's kind of that thing of, like, you know, a band's, you know, it's a cliche thing that a band's first album is their best album. People are always like, oh, they get worse after time. A lot of that's because of, you know, their taste drifting and stuff like that. The band, you know, grows in a different way or whatever. But a big part of that is that first album's so good because it took that band, you know, 10 years of playing and writing these songs and honing them down. And this album is like the best of the first 10 years of their career. And it's kind of the same thing with a comic a lot of times, their first special. And so the stuff comes after it. It may be really good, and they may, you know, write really well and go out there and just really, you know, pound the mics and do, you know, all the work to get it good for, you know, a new year. But it's still not going to live up to, you know, the best of your last 10 years. You know, that new hour every year mentality that the Louis crowd have is admirable, but it's not for everyone, and it doesn't necessarily produce the best content as we've seen lately. One thing I'll say about her special, The Dark Queen, though, is it has the worst outro song ever. I guess someone, I don't know if she named her special after the song or someone wrote it for her, but tonally, it doesn't fit at all, and it's really cheesy, and I don't know, it just took me out of it right away. But for the most part, I liked it. Just felt a little outdated. I would have loved it 15 years ago, but yeah, it is.
That outro song just screams Louis C.K. That has Louis' fingerprints all over it, because like he just loves to like do the whole music production part of it. You know, he loves that as a doing these specials. Like, he has the budget to pull in musicians, and he went and found that random guy, that random super specific singer to do the Louis intro. He just loves that shit, but he's not actually like a musician, so I can see him missing the mark on the outro song, but I'll just have to check that out. But yeah, I would bet $100 that he had something to do.
You know what? I bet you're absolutely right about that. He probably fucking overheard the guy talking in a record store one day about singing in a lounge, and he's like, oh, this guy. Do you think like up and coming comics, regardless of gender, like offer to like let Louis C.K. jerk off in front of him? Like, no, man, I'm cool. It doesn't bother me at all. You can do it. Or, you know, even I'm into it, whatever. I imagine it kind of pisses him off. Like, no, man, you can't see. No, you can't do it like that. See, that ruins it.
Yeah, Louis like, no, it only works when I catch you off guard in the pantry at the studio right before you're about to leave for the day.